Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this public lecture to be given by Professor Kevin Durrheim, the Jane and Aatos Erkko Visiting Professor in Studies on Contemporary Society at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. My name is Hanne Appelqvist and I'm the director of the Collegium. Established in 2001 as an independent institute of the University of Helsinki, the Helsinki Collegium follows the international model of an institute for advanced study. This is to say that our mission is to offer researchers space and time and freedom to pursue their own curiosity-driven research agendas in the humanities and social sciences. True to its name, the Helsinki Collegium is indeed a community of colleagues. Everyone works on their own research agendas, but comes together regularly to share ideas and get feedback from others, whether in the weekly seminar, the holy duty of our fellows, or around the coffee machine. The Collegium is well known for its collegial working environment, characterized by minimal hierarchy. Everyone at the Collegium is first and foremost a fellow, bringing their expertise to enrich the conversations in our weekly seminar and informal gatherings alike. That being said, a figure of special importance in our community is the Jane and Aatos Erkko Professor. This invitational professorship was made possible by a generous donation from the Jane and Aatos Erkko Foundation to the University of Helsinki in 2008, enabling the establishment of this flagship professorship at the Collegium. To date, the Helsinki Collegium has hosted 13 Erkko professors, all leading scholars in their respective fields, Kevin being the 14th. We have been extremely fortunate that he accepted our invitation and has already contributed so much to our community. Now, the focus of the Jane and Aatos Erkko Professorship is cultural and social research, especially on themes relevant for contemporary society and social justice. Few topics are more timely in this regard than Kevin's theme today, namely polarization in mind, social media, and public life. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who is eager to hear what he has to say. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to Professor Inga Jasinskaja-Lahti, who will properly introduce Kevin. Welcome again.
Thank you, Hanne. It's my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Kevin Durrheim, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Johannesburg, where he also leads the UJ Methods Club, which is a group promoting open access to open science in Africa. I learned from Kevin's profile in the internet that he holds an A rating from South Africa's National Research Foundation, which is a distinction reserved for researchers who are recognized as being among the world's top researchers in the field. Kevin's work focuses on many topics. Among them are intergroup relations, racism, segregation, social interaction and cooperation, polarization, group solidarity, and social change. At the heart of his research is a question: how do everyday discourse and social identities both shape and respond to moments of deep social transformation? In his own words, his overarching interest has been to understand how individuals conduct themselves, reflecting the interests and intentions of their time and place. He is both very productive and influential. Kevin has published nearly 200 academic works, and his interdisciplinary research brings together experimental methods, qualitative approaches, and more recently also machine learning and natural language processing. Thank you. He has co-edited several influential books, including Racial Encounter, Race Trouble, Qualitative Studies of Silence, and the Routledge International Handbook of Discrimination, Prejudice, and Stereotyping. In addition, he has co-authored widely used South African research methods textbooks. The reach of his work is remarkable. His publications have been cited almost 25,000 times, and the most cited piece, with nearly 6,000 citations, is the co-edited volume from 2006, Research in Practice, Applied Methods for the Social Sciences. This methodological handbook has been pioneering not only in its insistence on truly interdisciplinary applied social research, but also in its early and explicit call for more careful attention to ethics and for stronger inclusion of feminist and Black scholarship in social science research. On his ResearchGate profile, Kevin notes that his thinking has been deeply shaped by his experience of living under apartheid, and then through these profound transformations that followed. That biographical starting point continues to animate his scholarship. In 2024, Kevin published 2 articles that, in my view, will shape how future generations of social scientists think about their work. The first, in the South African Journal of Psychology, is titled The Psychology of Social Change, 30 Years Post-Apartheid, What Went Wrong and How to Fix It. In this article, Kevin reflects on 3 decades of research on the social psychology of social change in South Africa. He shows that although apartheid-era segregation has formally ended, race, as a fundamental organizing principle of identification, continues to structure the struggle for justice. Put differently, the color line of racial segregation has been replaced by what he calls an epistemic line of racial privilege. Kevin asks a critical question: how was white privilege able to survive the end of apartheid and an extensive program of desegregation and affirmative action? His analysis suggests that the answer lies in both enduring societal power structures and in the conventional scientific approaches that we have relied on to promote equality. He is particularly critical of the way contact theory has been uniformly used to promote intergroup relations, despite its demobilizing or even ironic effects in many contexts, and the fact that under certain conditions that may even help to preserve systemic inequality. Instead, he calls for action aimed at promoting epistemic justice, that is, recognizing and valuing the knowledge, experiences, and voices of all members of a community. This, he stresses, is not a call for nativism or for simply replacing one dominant, exclusive, or authentic way of seeing the world with another. Rather than insisting that the world looks like this from here and stopping there, Kevin invites us to consider opening up a dialogue among the many different heres that exist. He develops this further in his second 2024 article titled Conversational Silencing of Racism in Psychological Science, Toward Decolonization in Practice, published in Perspectives of Psychological Science. Here he offers a powerful critique of epistemic exclusion, white centering, and white ignorance. He argues that white supremacy in psychology is often sustained through conversational silencing, a process in which apparently neutral focus on doing good psychology systematically distracts attention from the realities of racism and the operation of power. Across these texts, Kevin makes an argument that is, I think, highly relevant for our own university. He points out that the epistemic line is nowhere more visible than in universities. We can see it in our student and staff demographics and in who occupies institutional leadership. For example, in our own institution, only about 1% of students are second-generation immigrants, or a better categorization would be the first-generation Finns, which is a stark indicator of who is imagined as naturally belonging to the university. As Kevin notes, the epistemic line is also inscribed in our buildings and spaces. The architecture around us today, including this classical Metsätalo building, designed in 1939 by the Swedish origin architect Johan Pavel, known by his Finnish name as Jussi Paatela, carries with it a certain vision of the word and a particular history of whose knowledge has been valued. And of course, the epistemic line runs through our curricula and research practices. As Kevin reminds us, the solution is not simply to invite previously excluded groups to join partnership that leave existing hierarchies intact. These are rarely equal partnerships between peers of equivalent epistemic standing, and they do not on their own transform the structural conditions that define the academy. Instead, he urges us to build networks, infrastructure, and research capacity in the global south and in other communities that have been placed on the wrong side of the epistemic line of exclusionary knowledge. To bring this introduction a bit closer to Kevin's lecture today, without spoiling it, I want to briefly mention his recent pioneering work on polarization in social media. In this research, his team used machine learning to construct speakers' landscapes that identify polarization based on how users speak rather than on who follows whom. Kevin will no doubt explain this better himself, but one striking finding is that our patterns of language use on social media reveal who we are and which ideological communities we belong to, even more clearly than the standard measures based on distances in interaction networks. This not only changes how we understand the dynamics of political polarization online, but also opens up new ways of identifying where the potential for social change might lie. Finally, together with his longtime collaborator, John Dixon, Kevin has emphasized that questions of who we are always intimately connected to questions of where are we. What is meant here is that the identification with place is not only about how we talk about themselves, but also about the material practices through which we build and maintain environments that make some of us feel at home and others less so. This is not Kevin's first visit to Finland. He has previously collaborated with researchers at the University of Helsinki and the University of Eastern Finland, and in 2025, he was also awarded an honorary doctorate in social sciences by the University of Eastern Finland. However, this is hopefully his longest stay so far at the University of Helsinki and at our Collegium, and I very much hope that these institutions and spaces are beginning to feel like an extended academic home for you, Kevin. Dear members of the Collegium, dear colleagues and friends of the university, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Kevin Durrheim. Please, Kevin.
Thank you, Hannah and Inga, for... I've never had such a long and detailed introductions. I feel small. I want to thank many people actually before coming here. Firstly, you for taking time out of your busy schedule and being here. There's so many webinars and events. And so it really is overwhelming to see friends, new acquaintances, and of course the fellows from the Collegium. The Collegium has been an incredible space for learning for me. Listening to all your presentations and in conversations, it's been incredible. It's been a creative space. Helsinki has been an incredible place to come, to run on these streets and to think and to work. So I feel really privileged to be here, and I think I speak on behalf of all the fellows that we are grateful for this time that we have at the Collegium. I also want to thank, I know there's friends and colleagues whose work I read and respect online, and I appreciate their being here as well. I want to talk a little bit about my recent work. It's on polarization, and there's a little bit of stuff on large language models, and it tries to give us a sense of where we are in history. That's where I want to work towards. I'm sort of talking out of my field, my immediate field of expertise. I'm busy working on a book called The Big World, and this here is about the big world, where I see the big world is. And it's not a good news story, so it ends a little bit on a bit of a downer, but we'll see how we get there. So, firstly, can I ask you a question? To what extent do you think Finland should allow people of different race or ethnic groups to come and live here? We will all be able to complete a questionnaire like this because we've all done it umpteen times. This technology was developed in the 1930s, and two things happened together to make this possible: public opinion polling. The first was the invention of the random survey, that you can estimate populations. And the second was the invention of this little response format, the attitude response format. They both happened in the 1930s. Public Opinion Quarterly, the flagship journal, was published first time in 1937. So we've had almost 100 years of competing scales like this. And of course, they're very good for measuring public opinion, because that's what we're here to talk about. And so, for example, officials, governments, the media, people are interested in public opinion. We can aggregate the opinions of individuals as they respond, and we find, for example, that, if I get this button, there we are, the most anti, the people that are least welcome are Muslims and then poorer countries outside Europe. But of course, we can also look that Europe is quite welcoming of some. So there is the standard measure of public opinion. Very soon it became apparent that there are social differences, the variation in public opinion. And this is data from the US. You can see the divergence between Republicans and Democrats in preference for immigration policy, and it's growing. So this phenomenon is been labeled polarization. And this is what we're going to be studying talking about in the next little while over here, polarization. The divides in society in public opinion. It's happening everywhere in the world. This is data from Finland. It's colleagues from Aalto University. They're producing some of the most incredible work on polarization. And these are opinions. This is I've gone the wrong direction. Maybe I'll let the cat out the bag. Okay. So these are opinions. This is 2019. It's before the 2019 election. This over here is 2023, before the 2023 election. And it's a model of tweets. I'll show you how these models are made later on in the talk. But you can see that there is a pulling apart between what they call the left and the right. There's polarization, and it's increasing polarization in public opinion around immigration. There's this over here is around social welfare, also 2019 to 2023, and you can see that public opinion, this is on Twitter, is increasingly becoming polarized in Finland, in the US, in South Africa, in just about every single country in the world. So we're talking about a kind of phenomenon, something that's happening in our global society. This over here is the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. They take 900 policymakers, governments, academics, experts in the field, and they say, what are the biggest risks facing humanity? And you'll notice risk number one up top there is misinformation and disinformation. Number 4, societal polarization. Those two things are completely related to each other. And then you've got climate change, and there's all these other crises that are confronting us. But polarization is one of the top risks in facing human society. Why? It leads to declining social stability. We can feel it, we can see it. It's on the news every day. Gridlocks in decision-making. I'll show you some of those gridlocks in decision-making later on. People can't make decisions, can't act. Institutions can't act. Economic disruption. Once again, the inability to make decisions, and political polarization. And of course, this has become increasingly interesting to academics. If you take a look at the graph that I've made there from Google Scholar, just you can see this rapid growth. The recent reviews, it's interesting, it's a scoping review of reviews. And this is the world that we've come into, sort of academia. 12,000 articles on political polarization published last year. No one can read them. So now we get not in reviews, but review of reviews. That's why we need AI to read all the papers that are being produced. So the review says the publication has increased steadily. Well, it's exponential. It's an important topic in the social sciences. And polarization has become, as I say, hyphenated. So political polarization, social media polarization, etc. I haven't read the literature, so I'm sure you'll be able to identify holes in what I'm saying. It's impossible to read it. So what is polarization? I'm going to talk a little bit in this talk about what is polarization, the psychology of polarization, and later on I'm going to talk about polarization in our society. The first use of the term that I was managed to find is 1948, so that's 10 years after public opinion polling starts, by Paul Lazarsfeld. He's an immigrant himself into the US. And he defines, it's around elections and polling for elections in the US. Polarization, he defines as sharper disagreement with members of other subgroups. So that's that little graph that I showed you earlier on, where there's this divergence of opinion between different groupings within society. Over the years, from 1948 until today, we know there are three other features, or there are three features that define what we can mean by sharp disagreement. And these are the three features here. The first is there's a polarization in opinions. And that there I'll characterize as a fences model of polarization. And then the second there is a polarization in terms of issue alignment. And that there has been characterized as an oil spill model of polarization. And then the third body of literature is around affective polarization. So it's linked to, I put there, anger and grievance. There's moral outrage, there are heightened emotions, but I think anger and grievance captures the essence of this affective polarization. So, starting off, so what is polarization? Firstly, opinion polarization, defined as this definitive definition. Opinions are far apart in content and relatively balanced between the two ends of the spectrum. So you have a society at one time where there's a difference of opinion. Maybe it's a bell curve. There's a normal curve of opinion. It starts breaking apart like this over here, and eventually the opinions start going further and further apart. We all know this over here is the feeling thermometer. How do you feel about foreigners, the poor, the president? How do you feel about them? And so what's happening in society in terms of opinion polarization, opinions are splitting. So the people on the left and the people on the right are becoming further and further apart in their opinions. And this has been called the fences model. In other words, these opinion fences, the ideological fences, are being erected in our societies. The second is termed the oil spill model. Della Posta called it the oil spill model of polarization. It's got to do with issue alignment. And the oil spill happens both within individuals and within society, according to this model. So it happens when people's opinions on one topic become correlated with the opinions on another. And this over here is the data from the colleagues at Aatos University. This is 2019. This is climate change, opinions on climate change, immigration, social welfare, economic policy, and education. In 2019, there's a very little correlation. These are correlation coefficients. The numbers go from 0 to 1, 1 being very strong correlation. So there's very weak correlation in society between these different opinions. So in other words, someone's view on immigration is unrelated to their view on attitudes, on climate change. But by 2023, we can see across the board these correlations have strengthened. So now, if you know what someone's opinion is on climate change, you can have a very good guess at what their opinion is about immigration, about economics, about social welfare, etc. There's an oil spill happening where everyone is being gathered together into these big homogeneous groups. Everyone's covered with the oil of polarization. There's this kind of homogenization in society. There's a breakdown in diversity of opinion. And then the third issue, so not only do we have fences between people, not only do we have this increasing alignment of opinions, but now the folks in the different groups start disliking each other. They start feeling angry towards the other. They start having outrage at hearing the opinions of the other. So those are those three aspects of polarization. This is US data. Most of this work on effective polarization is done in the US. So, what do you think about your own party, your own candidate? That stays the same. You like them a lot. And basically, from the year 2000, and I think this is an important year because this is the time I'm going to, it's correlational, but as I go on later, the internet and social media play a big role in this, I believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence to show that. So there's increasing anger in society. So those are the three aspects of polarization. Polarization is a sharp disagreement in society. It's about fences, there's an oil spill, and it's about grievance and anger. So what is the psychology of polarization? The early studies were conducted in the 1960s. I think 62, the paper by Stoner, the first paper. It was called the risky shift phenomenon. That's what the paper was entitled. It was actually a thesis. So at that stage, psychologists thought that if you got a whole lot of people together in a group and got them to discuss a topic, they would produce a more moderate opinion. So in other words, the extremes would be knocked off and then there would be a kind of convergence to the center. That was the theory. But what they found, and this was in discussion of like a risky investment phenomenon, should we go for this risky investment or should we take the conservative path? They found that groups went consistently for a more extreme position, for a riskier move. And then there's been lots of evidence over the time saying it's not necessarily a risk, because there'll also be a convergence toward conformity, but there's a convergence towards the extremes. So if you've got a small group of people and they're quite conservative, they become even more conservative with that economic risk. There's some studies by Moscovici. I've quoted, I've got this quote there. Polarization affects a change in attitudes towards a more extreme position, but also a change in the judgment of the attitude object. So not only is there a shift in opinions, but there's also a shift in belief about what the world is like. So discussion changes opinions. And it changes it in a way that was unexpected at the time. They expected a moderation to happen, but what happens in discussion is there's a tendency towards becoming more extreme in the opinion. So Moscovici studies in the 1960s were about de Gaulle. The question was, de Gaulle is too old to govern. And yes, he finds that in these person opinions, group discussion made groups more extreme. Why does this happen? The theories that have been proposed by social psychology, we can classify them into two basic kinds. these sort of convergence theories where people are converging to their group, but over here it's the group prototype. So there's the process of conformity. You get a kind of sense of what does the group believe, and then you try and conform to that, and you try and be more conformist than the group itself. So there's a conformity dynamic there that underlies it. There's also an informational influence. They're called informational influence because we're often very uncertain about what's in the world, and our beliefs about the world they're also social. So we believe what others believe. We don't make all our observations and our beliefs based on our own observations. We haven't read all the literature. We involved in these communities, and in dialogue and discourse, certainty or belief certainty can emerge. So these two conformity dynamics. There's one around normative pressure, the pressure of wanting to fit in, to be with the group, part of the group, and the other pressure of, so what is the world really like? What should we believe? Is De Gaulle really too old to govern? And then the other psychological dynamic was discovered much later in the 1970s and 80s around positive distinctiveness. So if you think that group believes that, then we become more different. So we become positively distinct from outgroups. So these two dynamics together robustly explain this choice shift or this risky shift phenomenon. So that is the underlying social psychology of what they call group polarization that comes out in the 1960s and 1970s. In recent years, the focus has shifted from small group discussions to big group discussions. And this shift has been prompted by the internet, the emergence of the internet. And I think this is the first paper that produced one of these network models of polarization, a damaging glance, 2005. And it was weblogs, it was blogs. And these were, the blue ones were Democratic aligned weblogs, and these were Republican aligned weblogs, and they just looked at who cited who, and they created a network model of citation. And basically what you find, and what they reported over there, and that's been found in literally hundreds of studies subsequently, is that this grouping over here likes to cite themselves. It's a bit like academic work, isn't it? This grouping over here likes to cite themselves, and there's very little cross-pollination between these two groupings. So this is the classic network model of polarization. These are interaction networks. You might have heard of the concept of an echo chamber. Have you? An echo chamber. So this idea was, Cass Sunstein said, this is the explanation. So why this is happening over here is because the internet has been produced far too much information for us all. We can't cope with it. And so what we do is we root ourselves down to small little groups where we've got all familiar friends and familiar opinions. And so you don't have to worry about the big complex world out there. And we can just stay in our little groups over here, and we're in our little filter bubbles, our little echo chambers, where we just share ideas amongst ourselves. So it's associated with information glut, the selective exposure to information. You reduce the information that you're exposed to. You just stay within your familiar little circles. And subsequently, there's been a lot of concern that social media algorithms are doing this work for us. So not only are we doing this work for ourselves, the social media is contributing to this. Now, this theory is wrong. Despite how many bits of evidence get presented, the idea of the echo chamber refuses to go away. Everyone knows about the echo chamber. It's not correct. The information doesn't make us reduce. The internet hasn't reduced the information we're exposed to, it's actually increased it. And there have been, I've read 5 experimental studies, large-scale experimental studies, where they stop people from engaging on the internet. They pay them to shut down their Facebook account. And and there's stacks of network studies as well that all show that the internet increases our exposure to information. People are not they're not putting themselves into little filter bubbles. But the point that I want to make here, and this is important for the talk that goes ahead, as the talk moves on. So there's a typo in the title, by the way. Polarization, I should say, in attitudes in social media, or public opinion in social media. So these are the first two models of public opinion and of polarization that I've discussed in this talk. And these are the two basic models of polarization in the literature. They both rely on an idea that public opinion is an aggregation of individual opinions. Very clear over here, for example. So you've got, there's Herbert Bloom in 1948 criticized this literature. It was a devastating critique of this literature. Basically, what is public opinion? Public opinion, you measure all these individuals' private little opinions, they fill out the questionnaire, and then you aggregate it, you work out the mean, and you work out a distribution. That's public opinion. It's a reduction of this complex phenomenon of public opinion to an aggregation of individuals' attitudes. And these models, these network models, are also aggregations. Of course, they're much more complex aggregations, but they're aggregations of individuals' opinions, but of course now in a network. So that also shows you something about the network structure. And the work that I've been doing is trying to develop an alternative model of public opinion and polarization. But before I get onto that, I want to just summarize. I think this is a fair enough summary of what we know about polarization today and on the internet. Firstly, it's not caused by ignorance. It's not that people have burrowed themselves down these little echo chambers as filter bubbles and now they're ignorant of everything else out there. No, people know exactly what everyone's saying. They know about it. So it's not about what the literature calls selective exposure. It's not about the social media algorithms. That's not what's causing polarization. It's probably driven by ideological sorting. That people are sorting themselves into groups that are similar to them ideologically, and they're sharing ideas and building these ideologies together. And they're doing this not only within Twitter, but across different platforms. So there's some research that looks at how these communities go from Twitter to YouTube to other platforms. So these communities, there's this kind of big network ideological structure that's developing in the digital sphere. It's fueled by anger, and especially amongst minorities, in other words, those that have historically had no voice. It's fueled by misinformation. I'm going to talk a little bit about misinformation. I've got it in quotes there as well, because there's a whole lot of controversy around what is information and what is facts and what is misinformation in this context. But also, especially amongst minorities, there's always those minorities out there that have got these extremist opinions fueled by misinformation. It's driven by elites. This is actually the picture, the model, this network model done by our colleagues in Aalto University. And I don't know if you can see, there's a core section over here. Those are the elites. The elites are more polarized than the public as a whole. So it's driven by elites. Both of those are influencers and political elites. It's driven by events. So things that happen in society, all of a sudden there is 5-10-fold multiplication in the number of people on Twitter talking about these things or on social media. And it's in this process, in this dynamic process, that this polarization happens. So polarization isn't just something that's there the whole time. There's these latent ideological pockets. And when events happen, they sort of become enlivened, and you get that kind of sense of polarization happening in society. And of course, the final point there, it's all over. The social media, from every single continent, the studies show the exact same thing. So I think that's our current understanding of the phenomenon. But this is where I want to go. So I said earlier on that the understanding of polarization is based on the aggregation of individual opinions. And I want to talk about polarization and think about polarization as a conversation. And I want to think about public opinion as a conversation. So polarization here is a conversational phenomenon. It happens in conversation. So it doesn't happen inside individuals' heads. It happens in conversation. As Dembski et al. Said, polarization is instantiated linguistically. Of course, it's instantiated linguistically in conversation. Because in conversation that people share their opinions, that they express their anger, that they create a sense of us and them. And so this is these large language models that Inga promised that I would talk about. And what these models are models of conversation. They're models of the public opinion. This public conversation, it's a multivocal conversation. So in other words, there's lots of people participating in this conversation. It's a conversation that's extended over time. So the conversation happens. This over here is conversations about land reform in South Africa. From 2013 to 2012, we took all the quotes in the media. We've got this big database of Southern Africa news, comprehensive database of Southern African news. We took every single quotation that when someone was quoted in that news, and we modeled it. And then we remodeled it again by just taking those quotes on land. And we can see here the public conversation. So it shows us a very interesting feature of this conversation. And we can call it, if you take a look over here, for example, the dots are people. And the little things over here are words, those are terms. So the dots are people, and those are terms. Then we've labeled the people by the political parties that they're in. So this part over here is a political party in South Africa called the Economic Freedom Fighters. They're a kind of pro-poor party. And the language that they're using, there's the word white supremacy, the expropriation of land, rubber bullets, economic freedom fighters, rightful owners. On this side over here, we have a party called the Democratic Alliance, and it's a pro-capital party. And the language they're interested in is they're concerned about land invasion, law enforcement, land grabs, farm murders. This has been picked up recently by Donald Trump, and so it's part of the whole alt-right, part of these big networks of connection. But a technical way of referring to this is a bipartite graph or bipartite network. It's a bipartite because there's two elements to it. There are people and there is language. And the people become distinct from each other by the language they use, and the language becomes ideological by the people that are using it. That there is the bipartite network. And this is what this conversation produces, this public conversation. It produces bias. That's what psychologists would call bias. It produces an association between a certain kind of language and a certain kind of people, certain kinds of people. And that there is, it's a conversational production. And I think that this is the foundation of polarization. So how do we create these models? I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on large language models. So it's a quantitative model of a large language model. Word embedding is a quantitative model of a word meaning. So historically in the social sciences, we use qualitative research to understand subjective meanings of words. So large language models and this technology has allowed us now to model word meanings quantitatively. And it does it by a machine learning. So we just train an algorithm to learn the meaning of words. So we put in, the input over here is natural language. It's a text corpus. This over here are tweets. But it can be the whole of parliamentary debate. It could be Well, the whole of Wikipedia. It could be Google News. Or if you ChatGPT, it's the whole of the internet. And then it outputs a matrix. These are word vectors. They're called, we might have heard the term word vectors. Each word has an address. 250 dimensions is the length of the address that we use. ChatGPT, I went and looked it up. 1.7 trillion parameters. That's their model. But it's the same thing. The model of ChatGPT and the word embedding is a very primitive form of it, but it's exactly the same thing. Well, not exactly, might be pushing it a bit much. This is a shallow model. It's essentially like a regression equation. It's a shallow large language model. It's like a regression equation, whereas theirs is a deep multi-layered one. But anyhow, that's besides the point. What does it produce? What does this word embedding produce, and how is it trained? Well, it's a simple text recognition task. That's how all these large language models, even ChatGPT has done the exact same thing. You give an algorithm language, natural language, strings of words, and its job is to guess what is the next word. Do you want to get something? No to vaccines. So it's trying to guess what's the next word, what's the next word, what's the next word, and it gets better and better and better and better and better at guessing if you give it enough words, until it can guess those words almost perfectly. Well, some words it might get mixed up because they could be used interchangeably. But that's the whole point. It measures the similarity of meaning of words. And then it creates these, it represents the structure in what they call hyperdimensional space or multi-dimensional space. Our dimension, as I said, is 250 dimensions. But if we reduce it down to 3 dimensions, like that, a sphere, we would have a sphere, a soccer ball, football. And every single word in the language would have one point on the surface of that ball. That's what a large language model is. It's a quantitative representation. So you've got this football here, and all the words are on the surface of this ball. The closer they are to each other, the more similar their meaning. In other words, the words could be used interchangeably. They're almost synonymous. Do you want to get COVID or do you want to get killed? Those two words could be used almost together. So they'd be very close together on the surface of this ball. And so we've got now a way of measuring the similarity of words. The interesting thing about it, this meaning is a conversational meaning. It's the natural meaning of words that people use in conversation. So it's a kind of Wittgensteinian theory of the meaning of language. The language, the words, the mean, how they're used in the natural language. So it's a conversational meaning. We can now measure their conversational meaning, and very importantly, in terms of the work that I've been doing, we can measure how similar people are. Because not only can we measure how similar different words are, but we can put people's names in there. In other words, the tweeters who are using those tweets or the people that are quoting. And then what this model does, it measures how similar each of those individuals are on the basis of the words that they use. So we've got this bipartite graph, this network, where we've got a distribution of people according to the language that they use, in other words, their conversation, and we've got a distribution of words or language by who uses those words. That's essentially what these large language models allow us to do. So they allow us to model and think about polarization as this conversation. Here's an example of what they show us. This over here was, this is the vaccination. This is 75 days before the World Health Organization declared the pandemic. People were talking on Twitter about vaccinations, and you'll see some of their concerns. Anti-vaccine, so there's anti-vaxxers over here. Vaccine autism, there's concerns. The dots are colored. The folks that extracted this data, they modeled, they colored the dots. They created 5 different communities on the basis of who they followed. So these were like public health. They called this the public health community. There are many doctors, etc., scientists in this yellow or gold community. These were the anti-vaxxers, the black community. And over here were Democrats and Republicans. It's US data. There was no distinction between Democrats and Republicans. There was a kind of political part of this network. There was the anti-vaxxers, and then there was the medical field over there. What happens during the pandemic? So this is 75 days before the pandemic. This is 75 days from the pandemic to 75 days. And I think it's very, very clear what's happening in that society. It's becoming polarized. It's becoming politically polarized. How is it becoming polarized? People are incredible. I mean, just in the tweets that they're doing, they are able to differentiate politically themselves from each other in their tweets almost 100%. So it's absolutely amazing the way in which people can use language in such a way to make themselves not look like those other people. But the differentiation is much more fine-grained than just between the Democrats and Republicans. So basically what happens over here is that the Republicans, they started borrowing the language of anti-vaxxers in their talk, so they've now converged with the anti-vaxxers, and then the Democrats start borrowing the language of the public health. And so they know what these other languages are. They're not ignorant of the other languages, but they're able to talk in a way that differentiates themselves from the other. And it's even to this little point over here is an interesting little point in this network. Because here you've got Bill Gates vaccine agenda, no to vaccine, Gates vaccine. So these, we can call these here, are like the anti-vaxxers. These over here are the vaccine hesitants. So the fine-grained distinctions in the way in which people use language to differentiate themselves from others. So that there is the way in which we model polarization and public opinion as a conversation. The advantage of doing this is that it allows us to think, as soon as we've taken polarization and public opinion out of the aggregation of individuals, we look at a conversation. Now we can start asking questions about what is the history of that conversation? Where does that conversation come from? What supports that conversation? Where is that conversation going? And what I found a very useful resource in doing this is the work of Jürgen Habermas. If you just take a look at his quote here about the public sphere, and you think about those network, those large language models that were shown you, you'll see that Habermas's fits in perfectly with this type of work. I think so. The public sphere can best be described as a network for communicating information and points of view. You've got information, you've got points of view, they're being communicated, it's conversational. They're filtered and synthesized in such a way that they coalesce into bundles of topically specified public opinions. That's what those graphs have shown. They've shown bundles, coalesced bundles of people and opinions. That is what conversation in the public sphere produces. It allows us to think now and to put this conversation into a context, and these are the contexts that I'm interested in, the context of history. Habermas's work itself, the public sphere, the bourgeois public sphere, is a historical account of the emergence of this European, a specifically European public opinion. It's supported by technologies, the conversation. It is supported by mechanisms of social influence, and it has plays out in terms of power and the power distribution in society. So Habermas's own work traces the origin to post-Enlightenment Europe. So, those of you that know this literature at all, the salons and coffee houses of Europe. So in other words, we've got the conversation starting to happen between the bourgeois, who's now challenging sovereign power, the feudal state. And how they're doing it through having a conversation about power. That is, according to Habermas, the origins of the public sphere, the origins of this form of sociality. It's supported by printing, the pamphlets in those early stages, so people have a shared view. Benedict Anderson's work, this brilliant book, 1983, written before Habermas's work was translated into English, his 1962 book was only translated in 1989. So Benedict Anderson didn't actually refer to Habermas or the public sphere, and yet he's writing about the emergence of the nation state, and it's the role of printing and the role of new technologies in creating a conversation is very, very similar, as he later on and others have said, to Habermas's work. So basically what Benedict Anderson says is that the nation state, as we know it, it emerges from printing. And he's got a fantastic quote there where he says the mass ceremony of daily newspaper reading replaced the mass ceremony of morning prayers. So in this increasingly secularizing society, folks are reading the newspaper, and they had a sense, as they read the newspaper, of themselves having an opinion, and of everyone else in this community also reading this newspaper and having an opinion. So we see how a large-scale conversation is made possible by the emergent technology of printing, and how a large-scale conversation makes possible differences of opinion and the ability for the populace, the bourgeois, to come together to contest power. And of course, the authorities over the course of this history take this public sphere and take public opinion very, very seriously. Hence the emergence of the public opinion industry in our time. Moving on, I'm going here in 4 steps of centuries. So the technologies change, and public opinion changes, and the forms of social influence change, and governance, power changes as this conversation develops over time. Noelle-Neumann talks about, she says, people are constantly, this is writing in the age of mass media. People are constantly monitoring the environment and observing the reactions of others. The fear of isolation experienced in case of deviation corresponds to the exhilaration felt during commonly shared group experiences. There is the sense of, do I fit in? Habermas himself writes about this, the role of mass media. He uses the term refeudalization. So now all of a sudden, this public opinion, this public sphere, is being co-opted into the interests of power through commerce. I mean, the Frankfurt School is writing about the way in which commerce and political motives are now being infiltrating into this public sphere and is used to sort of manage public opinion. And the whole of the 20th century is around the management of public opinion, but the advantage for authority, for commerce, and for power in the 20th century is the mass media, the centralized media. That, of course, there's difference of opinion, but it's mainly driven through these mass television, radio, newspapers, etc. And this is where the digital public sphere creates a fundamental change. To give us a sense of what's going on, I thought, like, how can I try and communicate this? I thought, let's take a contrast. This is from 30 years. This is McChesney's writing about, in 1996, about the prospects for the internet and the public sphere and for the public conversation. And this, the most recent paper I've read here is Salas 2025. Just got this paper, I think, last week. I've read it. It's a fantastic empirical study. And just take a look over these 30 years, how these authors, these scientists, are looking towards the future. I think it's quite diagnostic. So McChesney says cyberspace may, okay, it's not all like utopian. There's also these dystopian thoughts. Even in 30 years ago, it's may. But just look at the language. Cyberspace may provide a psychedelic version of ham radio. I thought that's pretty cool. Everyone's got their own little ham radio, and they're just having their own little conversation. Fantastic. It may provide that. A Habermasian public sphere where informed interactive debate can flower independent of government and commercial control. Hope of the internet as a tool for extending the public sphere from the bourgeois to everyone. There's a hope for genuine participation, democracy. Take a look. This is the most recent paper I've read, just out. Addressing polarization demands, this is in the conclusion. Now, if you want to, after all this empirical work that we've done, on the basis of the study, addressing polarization demands strategies that bridge ideological divides and builds trust in both institutions and science. That's quite a tall order, isn't it? Can anyone think of how we're going to do that? How we're going to bridge ideological divides and build trust in institutions and science? And how we're going to do that before climate change burns us all up? Can you see what's happened in the last 30 years in terms of the impact of the digital public sphere on this conversation? Okay, so here's an overview of the impact of the digital public sphere on the conversation. Well, firstly, there's a technological overview. It's produced a decentralized big world. That's where my book comes from, the big world, because mass media couldn't get to the big world. It had national boundaries. The internet, at the moment, they're putting every single dollar they can into build that internet backbone right through Africa. Every little kid at school, in every little village, the hope is to have your smartphone and be connected to the internet. So the possibility of a truly global conversation, I mean, it's not a reality yet, but it's horizontal. It's aspirational. So, of course, the big world is also a small world. What do we mean by small world? You know that the small world phenomenon, we're all connected by 6 degrees of difference to everyone else in the world. Your friend of your friend of your friend, your friend, and when you go down that, you're connected to everyone else in the world. That's a small world. So it's a big world, but it's also a small world. So in the small world, information moves very quickly over these networks. There's viral transmission of information. So that is the technological backbone. I'm not going to deal with the psychology. If you're interested in that, Jonathan Haidt's book called The Anxious Generation, I think provides very solid evidence that exponential increases in suicide attempts, depression, etc., amongst teens, in other words, those that are exposed to social media from 2012, that's when sort of Facebook really started and social media really starts. It just, from then, it just goes up. What's the psychological effects? People feel isolated. You might be feeling like this as well. Isolated, evaluated, and ignored. So you put up those posts and like no one really shows much interest. Has a huge impact. Or negative feedback. This hyper evaluation of oneself. The anxious generation. But what I'm interested in here is conversation. The norms of conversation. And how the public sphere is now changing the way in which conversation happens. And I just want to discuss very briefly, I've got a few minutes left here, these 4 different features. The first is incivility norms. So we know a lot about what they call moral emotions. Brady and von Balvel, there's been quite a lot of work that moral emotions, if you express outrage on social media, that's what gets picked up. So in other words, if you are feeling ignored and you want to write a post that everyone else is going to forward, what must you write? Anger. It works. Or if you externalize your own personal distress, it also works. So these are new norms, conversational norms that are emerging. Flaming and what they call echo slamming. The attack, angry attack. But I put the other 2 here the email or non-response, I don't think this is just other people, because I'm also part of this incivility. 10 years ago, I'd respond to all emails that were addressed to me personally, and now I respond to only a fraction of them. I'm rude. And I've become rude, because I think a lot of them are absolutely, I think it's machines sending me stuff, asking me to write papers for like journals that I've never heard of. But I'm sure it's not only machines. I'm sure there's also people sending me that stuff, but we just can't cope anymore, so we're rude. This is an interesting one, repair incompletion. You might not have heard about this. This is also a very recent study by Goddard and Gillespie. Now, conversational repair is fundamental to conversation. It's part of the architecture of how conversations happen is repair. Repair is built into conversation. So in other words, when you say something and it's wrong, or you offend someone else, and someone says to you, how can you say that? And you'll say, sorry, you misunderstood me. I didn't mean that, I meant this. That's repair. Now, conversation analysts have shown repair is universal. Everyone does it. They do it all the time. You never leave repairs unrepaired, because if you do, you're just kicked out of a community. It's rude. It's uncivil. On the internet, half of them go uncompleted. I mean, that is a big change in universal conversational norms in a very short period of time. In other words, someone criticizes you, just forget about it and just carry on over here. And it's creating these boundaries between these communities, this agglomeration that Habermas was describing, and that large language models show, these incivility norms. Related to that is social fragmentation. So you've got these ideological groups of fragmenting into like micro little groups, these small little groups of what they call opinion-based groups. And people, these communities are developing their own language to differentiate themselves, new words, new terms, to differentiate themselves from others. These are, I'll put the effective harbors, little places where you can feel safe. And of course, we mobilize collective action into this. And I've used the example of sovereign citizens in pseudo-law. I've just learned about this very recently in the Collegium. And it's just a fantastic example of a small little opinion-based group. And it's an example of how this isn't just an opinion-based group, it actually has big impacts in our world. If you've never heard of sovereign citizens or pseudo-law, do a little internet search. This is by a judge, a quote of a paper by a judge in Australia. It's tempting to dismiss these arguments concerning, let me go over here where I can read better, concerning the living man in the People's Court of Terra Australis. So they've got this kind of sort of antiquated language of law that they try and disrupt the legal system with. You have no right over me. I'm a sovereign citizen. So it's tempting for the law to dismiss this as nonsense, gibberish, gobbledygook, but not diminish the serious impact these delusional arguments can have on the authority of the court. And it's, you can get ChatGPT to write you legal cases in this lingo. And you can really disrupt decision-making and institutions. So these small little groups that no one's even heard of, and there's hundreds, thousands of them, can organize together, can build solidarity, and can strategize in ways that impact the whole. So the fragmentation. And then I call this local epistemics. I don't know if that is a good way of doing it, but it's basically that all these groups have their own truths, facts, standards of evidence, morality, etc. Epistemic islands, little epistemic islands where the opinions of others within this group count as what's true. And it's really interesting, some of the work that I've been looking at, fact-checking. You think, okay, fact-checking is going to do this. We can fact-check the truth. But actually, fact-checking just becomes part of the whole thing. This is a recent study here, 2017, not so recent. Fact-checks advantageous to Democratic Party were retreated mainly by Democrats, and those that are advantageous to the Republicans retreated. So these different communities, they've got their own facts and their own fact-checkers. So it's local epistemics. And of course, you can see how it works. I mean, I still know some people that take ivermectin regularly. Ivermectin was, I don't know if it was in Finland, but certainly in South Africa, there were all these ivermectin folks. It cures COVID, folks, ivermectin. It was a veterinary medicine sort of for worms. And this is an example of, from quoting the Atlantic of this kind of logic, this local epistemics. There are dozens of studies showing ivermectin. Do the research yourself, you know. There are dozens of studies showing ivermectin beats COVID, but big pharma and media are hiding the results because they can't make money off a cheap drug. How do you get through that? It's foolproof. It's insulated. It's a local epistemic. So not only do we have this fragmentation, this incivility, but there's this local epistemics being produced. And of course, this might sound like some kind of psychedelic ham radio, but it's not. There's big power that's using, just as the public sphere has always been a form of negotiation. It's been a public conversation that has been negotiating power. It continues in this new form to negotiate power. And I think there's no better way of doing that than this is Trump's inauguration. With what are called there, I think other people call themselves tech bros. There's over $1 trillion, apparently, one of the reports, $1 trillion in personal wealth, just in this little group of people. It's quite a lot of money, a lot of resources. And of course, they control the social media. And they have an impact on which bit of this fragmented space can get prominence. So whereas the age of mass media was, we can call it an age of majority influence, where it was controlled by this mass, now we've got the age of minority influences, a fragmentation of the public sphere, open to new forms of power, dispensations, activity, strategy, etc. And that brings me to the sort of concluding, sort of the negative bit of this talk. So if we think about the public sphere as a conversation that started way back there, post-Enlightenment, and has grown and developed over the ages. It's a very particular conversation. It's a European conversation. It's got very particular forms of social influence. I think they've been historically destructive. Where are we now in that conversation? And this over here is actually smoke, believe it or not. It comes from a physics journal. It's smoke hitting a wall. And it shows you what happens, and this is, I think, in terms of the social sciences, where social psychology, at least my own discipline, needs to go. We need to look at these big processes, these pan-scalar processes of social psychological dynamics, these historical processes. So where are we? Where is this conversation? Because why I think this is useful, because I think at one stage the nation state was quite containing. And Habermas' own hope was, his normative theory of rational discourse was, the foundations of democracy are to be found in the public sphere. He's hopeful. I mean, he's criticized for it, but he's hopeful. Because there was some way in which there would be reason and order, and there would be, we'd be able to work out an inclusive, rational future. But I think that the stage is past. I'm going to conclude with the words of Yeats in his poem, The Second Coming. I think it's the text has changed from what I had earlier on. But he writes this in 1920, and it's just after the war. And you can see him expressing a sense of this breakdown of the conversation. Turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Quoted by Achebe in the title of his book about the impact of colonization on Igbo society. So there was a different conversation happening in society, a different form of person or a different form of social influence, completely eaten up by the European public sphere. And there was a sense of while it was being eaten up, that everything was falling apart. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Thank you.